So my presentation today is women's equality and how it can be taught in the classroom. My agenda for this presentation is first, I just wanted to tell you some things about my background that weren't mentioned in the beautiful introduction. And then I wanted to tell you guys about how the role of women and the history of women are depicted in our Indiana social studies standards. And then how with those standards, the history of women can be taught in the classroom. So I'm originally from Northwest Indiana. I grew up in Portage. My family is Latino. My mom is Mexican and my dad is Puerto Rican. But I was raised by a single mother in a working class upbringing. So from an early age, I learned resilience, hard work, and strength. As my introduction said, now I teach social studies at Barker Middle School, and I'm in my 6th year of doing that. And then I have these other leadership roles with being the middle school social studies department chair for Michigan City area schools, being a part of the decisions with the board of directors, with the Indiana Council for the Social Studies. And then I also write items for the Indiana Department of Education that are used for their standardized assessments. I wanted to start my presentation today with this quote by Abigail Adams, and it's a letter that she wrote to John Adams on March 31st, 1776. In this letter that she writes to him a couple months before the colonists win the American Revolution, she says, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands." Interesting historical fact, too, during this time is with the 13 colonies, many of the colonies did have the right to vote for women, but that right was later stripped away after the states developed their own constitutions after the Revolution. To show you guys the Indiana standards for social studies, I took the liberty of going through all the standards starting from kindergarten all the way until the 12th grade and seeing the number of standards that mentioned women's history. And with the standards, I just did searches like feminism, women, and any key term I could think that related to our gender. With the elementary level, I used the grades kindergarten through 6th, and there wasn't a standard about the role of women until the 4th grade. In the 4th grade is when students begin to study Indiana history, and we see 2 standards about women there. And the first standard relates to Abraham Lincoln's presidency and how it affected Indiana, and they specify that women and children on the home front need to be covered. Then in the second standard that we see, it says that students need to learn about how women's suffrage was an important event that affected and changed life in Indiana in the early 20th century. 5th grade is when students study U.S. history for the first time, and there's only one standard in 5th grade devoted to women, which is identify contributions of women and minorities during the American Revolution. And there we see different women listed that teachers could use as examples in that unit of study. 6th grade, they study Western world history. And then we just see one standard as well, which is looking at the changing role of women in the Industrial Revolution. Unfortunately, with Indiana's standards at the elementary level for social studies, a lot of teachers have a lot of pressure to teach language arts and math standards because those are so heavily tested. So these few standards that we see relating to women with social studies can be ignored since they're not considered priority. At the middle school level, which is 7th and 8th grade, with 7th grade, they learn about Eastern world history, and there is not one standard devoted to the role of women with the Eastern world. And in 8th grade, they cover U.S. history again, and we see 2 standards there. Look at the changing role of women in the mid-19th century and compare the role of women in the northern, southern, and western states. and then looking at social reform movements such as feminist movements during that time frame as well. In high school, with ninth grade, they studied geography and history of the world. Same theme, no standards for women. 10th grade, world history and civilization, again, there is none. 11th grade, when they cover U.S. history for the third time, we do see two standards for for women's history. One with looking at social and cultural movements within the progressive era, which includes studying Ida B. Wells and women's suffrage. And then that second standard, looking at new cultural movements of the 1920s, like the emergence of women in the public sphere and the professions. And then lastly, with 12th grade, when they study U.S. government and economics, there's no standards devoted to women there. And I think that that is a very missed opportunity at 12th grade, because in 12th grade, most students are becoming of age to vote. So there not being a standard there, it doesn't remind the women in that classroom the power of their vote. In high school, students can also take electives if they choose to with these social studies curriculums. They could take an ethnic studies class, but there's not a standard devoted to women in that either. And then there's also a new Indiana history curriculum because of the bicentennial last year. And there's two standards with that curriculum, like how were women affected during the Civil War, and then also how the women's suffrage movement impacted residents of Indiana. With that second standard, it does mention examples of different key persons that teachers could use, but we don't see our own Michigan City, Naomi Anderson, or Zeola Missner in there either. And I also wanted to point out with this Indiana history course that it just was created last year, so not every high school in the state of Indiana even offers this class yet. And because it's only an elective, not every student would be exposed to these two standards either. So in essence, you have throughout kindergarten through 12th grade, with all these Indiana social studies standards, women are only mentioned 10 times maximum. And then if you take out the elective courses, you're lucky if a student gets exposed to women's history 8 times. In each year of social studies standards, there's about 60 standards each year. And so if you look at all the different courses for social studies, and then you times that by 60 standards, that's about 1,200 social studies standards, and then you have women mentioned 10 times at best. And then social studies standards are not even priority standards to many school districts, so a lot of opportunity is missed there. So why is this problematic? As I just said, with the priority standards, teachers strictly have to follow their curriculum standards and mapping, and students today aren't necessarily learning the role of women in our country. Why is it important that we change this? Well, we must teach women their history because it can be empowering to them to create the continued change that we need in our society. This can be overcome, though, in a variety of different ways. I can't think of one time period in history that women were not involved in. With either U.S. history or global history or state history. So you could include the female perspective in just about any other of those standards that need to be covered. So I always make sure that I include multiple perspectives in my classroom, and I wanted to share with you guys some ways that I do. This is an activity that I recently had my students do in their digital interactive notebooks for my class during this time of virtual learning. And one of my priority standards that I have to teach is the difference between primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources being sources from the time period, and secondary sources being those after the fact. So in this activity, the students, they have to look at these examples here that are all about Susan B. Anthony, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, and tell me by these examples if they're primary or secondary. So a letter from Susan B. Anthony encouraging support for women's suffrage. Since Susan B. Anthony wrote the letter, it would be a primary source. A newspaper article published in 1915 describing a women's suffrage rally in 1915. The students would identify that as primary. So that's a way to expose them to the history of women in our country as with another standard. In my classroom, I have the students participate in the National History Day program, and that is a nationwide contest where students create independent historical research projects. Those projects, we work on them for months, and they take a lot of hand-holding along the way. And a lot of the scaffolds that I give for them, I use examples of women's history in the United States as well as Indiana. And so here we see where they have to practice writing things in the past or present tense, and it uses examples from Madam C.J. Walker's life. In this example here, it's where I teach students how to analyze primary sources. So I give them this photograph from a factory in Indiana with all female workers. And then I'm teaching them how to cite the bibliographic information on this source, as well as list things that they notice. Why do they think this source was created? What are questions they would ask the author or creator of this source, and why? What are questions that are left unanswered after looking at this photograph? And then this has them practice asking themselves historical research questions that they should dive into, like long before the event that they want to study, right before the event, main event, what happened right after and long after. And it uses all examples of questions, again, from Madam C.J. Walker's life. And then this helps them write out the main ideas of the background portion of their project. And I used here in this scaffold the topic of Indiana women's suffrage. And then this is a graphic organizer showing them ways that they can organize their project. Students have to either make an exhibit board, which is like a science fair board, or a documentary, a website, a performance, or they could write a research paper. So this helps them to think about all the things they need to include with their project. So they could use this example that I made for them of Madam C.J. Walker's life. And then lastly, the scaffold of how to write a thesis statement. And so I have them look at the who, what, where, when, and why with women's suffrage in Indiana. In my class, we also do a lot of cross-curricular novel studies with the language arts teacher. And in 7th grade last year, the students read this book, Amal Unbound by Asha Saeed. And then in 8th grade, they read the novel Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. The novel Amal Unbound covers a Pakistani girl fighting for her right to an education. And then the novel Chains focuses on a slave during the American Revolution, and from her perspective, not knowing what side to take with either the Patriots or the British, and what would be more advantageous for her. So the 7th graders last year with the novel Amal Unbound, they used that to be the theme of their history projects that I was elaborating on a bit ago. So with those history fairs, they compete at a school level, and then those that do really well can advance to regionals. If they do well at regionals, they can advance to state, and then all the way up to nationals. Here's some pictures from the Barker History Fair last year, and these are boards that the students made. And so we see that some kids did their boards on Benazir Bhutto, who was the first female prime minister of Pakistan. And then we see other students looking at a board of Malala Yousafzai, who's fighting for girls' education there. And so they present their projects to each other, and they present their projects to different community members. And then this is a project of a student of mine who advanced to state, and she's presenting a website she made on Malala Yousafzai to professors at Notre Dame. And then I also forgot to mention too, but I don't have a picture of it because the student is shy. One of my students last year, his project went to state on Benazir Bhutto, the first female prime minister of Pakistan. So with my 7th grade curriculum, as I showed you guys earlier, there's not one standard devoted to women. However, I fixed that in my class by having them do those projects. And then being the social studies department chair at the middle school level, I work with a lot of my colleagues for them to incorporate these multiple perspectives as well. So in the other hallway, they were reading the novel A Long Walk to Water that discusses the civil wars that occur in South Sudan. And the book is mostly written from a male perspective, but we encouraged this group of girls to create a documentary for the History Fair on the lost girls of Sudan. So in essence, my presentation was talking about, even though there's not a lot of standards in Indiana devoted to the history of women and their role in our country, our state, and our world, it can easily, definitely be changed to empower future women to come. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm more than willing to answer.